In the 1830s, at the edge of the greatest empire on earth, there was a strip of land less than 1,000 feet long. To the men confined there, it felt like the end of the world. They called it the 13 Factories. This was the only crack in the door. For nearly a century, this was the sum total of Western commerce with China. This strip, in this city, Canton, every bolt of silk, every chest of tea, every piece of porcelain that fueled European desires had to pass through this bottleneck. And it was a system entirely designed by and for the Qing Empire. Foreign merchants could not speak directly to Chinese officials. They could not learn the language. They could not bring their families. They could not even leave this factory quarter without permission. This was the Canton system. And for the British Empire, the workshop of the world, it was an intolerable constraint. The problem was simple, and it was bleeding Britain dry. The British public had developed an insatiable thirst for Chinese tea. By the early 19th century, they were importing over 30 million pounds of it every year. They craved silks and porcelain. But China, supremely confident in its own civilization and self-sufficiency, wanted almost nothing Britain produced. So Britain paid, in silver, mountains of it. The silver flowed east in a relentless stream, a direct drain on the British treasury. Between 1811 and 1819 alone, Britain imported over 72 pounds million worth of Chinese goods, primarily tea. The trade deficit was staggering, and it was unsustainable. But in the warehouses of British India, a solution was growing. A sticky, dark, and profoundly dangerous solution: opium. The British East India Company, having consolidated its rule in India, perfected the cultivation and processing of the poppy. In vast stacking rooms in Patna and Bengal, thousands of balls of raw opium were prepared, packed into chests, and shipped east. This was the circuit that would reverse the silver flow. British merchants, and increasingly private country traders, would smuggle the opium into China. Chinese addicts, from laborers to merchants, from soldiers to court officials, would pay for it in silver. That silver would then be used to buy the very tea Britain wanted. The triangle was closed, the drain reversed. The numbers tell the story of an accelerating catastrophe. In 1810, 4,500 chests of opium entered China. By 1838, that number was 40,000. The outflow of silver was devastating. From an inflow of millions of ounces in the early 1800s, China began hemorrhaging over 9 million ounces of silver a year back to the West by the 1830s. The poison was not just financial. It was social, physical, and spiritual. Opium dens proliferated. Productivity collapsed. The very fabric of Qing society was unraveling. The Dagwang Emperor faced a crisis that threatened not just the treasury. He needed a man of unshakable principle. He needed a hero. He appointed Lin Zexu. Lin Zexu was the model Qing scholar official. Brilliant, austere, incorruptible. He believed fervently in the Confucian moral order and the emperor's divine mandate to protect his people. When he saw opium, he did not see a commodity or a revenue problem. He saw an evil. His memorials to the throne were fiery and prophetic. "If we continue to pamper this evil," he wrote, "a few decades from now, we shall not only be without soldiers to resist the enemy, but also in want of silver to provide an army." He argued for targeting the foreign pushers, not the Chinese users. The emperor agreed. In March of 1839, Lin arrived in Canton like a moral whirlwind. He surrounded the foreign factories with troops. He cut off all food and communication. For 6 weeks, 350 foreign merchants were held captive in their own homes and offices. His demand was absolute: surrender every chest of opium in your possession. The British Superintendent of Trade, Captain Charles Elliot, faced an impossible choice. To refuse meant watching his countrymen starve or be attacked. Reluctantly, he ordered the merchants to comply. He promised them, on his own authority, that the British Crown would compensate them for their losses. It was a promise that would turn a commercial dispute into a national crusade. They rendered over 20,000 chests, 2.6 million pounds of raw opium. Then Lin Zexu set about making a point the world would never forget. At Humen, on the shores of the Pearl River, Lin orchestrated a methodical, monumental destruction. The opium was mixed with salt and lime and flushed into the sea. The operation took 23 days. It was an act of ecological violence. Lin himself offered prayers to the spirits of the sea for the pollution. But above all, it was a spectacular declaration of moral and sovereign authority. He believed he was acting from a position of unassailable righteousness. And to make that righteousness clear to the very source of the poison, he performed one more act. He wrote a letter. "We have heard that in your own country opium smoking is forbidden under severe penalties. This means that you are aware of how harmful it is. By what right do you then use this poisonous drug to injure the Chinese people? The wealth of China is used to profit the barbarians." What is it but to trade one's own country's advantage for a thing which is not only useless but harmful? The letter to Queen Victoria was a masterpiece of moral reasoning from a Confucian worldview. It appealed to shared humanity and the responsibility of a ruler. But it was based on a fatal misconception that Britain and China operated within the same framework of ethics and tributary diplomacy. It never reached the Queen, and its arguments would be answered not with words, but with cannon fire. For in London, the news of Lin's actions, the humiliation of British subjects, the destruction of private property valued in the millions of pounds, was met not with introspection, but with outrage. The merchants' lobby howled for restitution and for the permanent opening of China. The British government, now holding the bill Eliot had promised, saw a casus belli. Lin Zexu had thrown down a gauntlet he believed was moral. The British Empire picked it up as a matter of national honor, free trade, and imperial power. The spark for the conflagration came soon after. In July 1839, a group of drunken British sailors killed a Chinese villager, Lin Zexu. Superintendent Eliot, fearing they would be executed summarily under Chinese law, refused to hand them over. Tensions exploded. Chinese war junks moved to enforce a blockade. British merchant ships, backed by the Royal Navy, opened fire. The first shots of the First Opium War were fired. Lin Zexu had won a great moral victory at Humen, but he had unwittingly unleashed a force he could not comprehend, an industrializing Western empire, armed with a new sense of historical destiny and powered by steam and steel, for which free commerce was the highest law and naval supremacy the final argument. He had challenged the system. Now the system was coming for him, and for all of China. The war that began in the waters off Canton in 1839 was not a clash of comparable empires. It was an autopsy, a dissection of an ancient body politic by the surgical instruments of the Industrial Revolution. So, the Qing military was built for a different world. Its bannermen, once the unstoppable cavalry that conquered China, now garrisoned cities. Its navy consisted of wooden junks, designed for river patrol and suppressing pirates. Their cannons were fixed, difficult to aim, and fired with erratic powder. Their strategy was one of majestic defense, of intimidating barbarians with the spectacle of imperial might. Against them sailed a new kind of demon. The Nemesis was the world's first iron-hulled warship to see combat. Built in Liverpool, she was a floating revolution. Her shallow draft meant she could sail up rivers the Chinese believed impassable. Her steam engines made her impervious to the winds that dictated all other naval movement, and she was armed with Congreve rockets and pivot-mounted cannons. To the Chinese defenders watching from the forts of Chuanpi, she was an incomprehensible horror, a devil ship. They fired their cannons. The shots bounced off her iron hull like pebbles. The Battle of Chuanpi was less a battle than a demonstration. British steamships like the Nemesis circled the clumsy junks, raking them with infighting fire. They towed sailing ships into perfect position. In a few hours, a key element of China's coastal defense was reduced to burning wreckage. This was the pattern. The British fleet refused to be drawn into a long war in the south. Instead, they executed a cold, strategic masterstroke. They went north. They seized ports, blockaded trade, and demonstrated their power ever closer to the capital. The Qing court was paralyzed. Some officials, realizing the futility of their technology, advocated for negotiation. Hardliners called for greater resistance. The emperor vacillated, blaming messengers and executing commanders for failure. Lin Zexu, the man who had started it all, was disgraced and sent into exile. But the British were not yet finished making their point. To force a complete surrender, they needed to strike at the very heart of China's internal communication and wealth. In the summer of 1842, they pushed into the Yangtze River. Their target, the city of Zhangyang, the crucial gateway where the Grand Canal, the lifeline feeding Beijing, met the Yangtze. Xinjiang was defended not by the usual Chinese Green Standard troops, but by Manchu bannermen, the Qing Dynasty's own ethnic elite, stationed there to ensure loyalty. For them, there was no retreat. Their families lived within the city's walls in a segregated quarter. Defeat meant not just professional failure, but the utter annihilation of their community. On July 21st, 1842, the British attacked. The outer defenses fell quickly. Then the British turned their ships' guns on the city walls, blasting holes and opening the way to the streets. What followed was not just a military defeat, but a social suicide. As British troops pushed into the city, they found scenes that would haunt them. Knowing the fate that awaited them, the rape, pillage, and slavery that followed a fallen city in their own cultural memory, hundreds of Manchu families chose death. Officers killed their wives and children before taking their own lives. Wells were found, filled with bodies. Whole households hung themselves from their rafters. The streets, as one British officer recorded, literally ran with blood. The Battle of Zhenjiang broke the king's will to fight. The message was unmistakable. British power could reach anywhere, and its cost would be cataclysmic, not just for the state, but for the very social order the dynasty was sworn to protect. 5 weeks later, with the British fleet poised to attack the former capital of Nanjing, Chinese commissioners boarded the British flagship Hobbes Cornwallis on August 29, 1842. The Treaty of Nanjing was signed. Its terms were dictated, not negotiated. China was forced to cede the island of Hong Kong to Britain in perpetuity, providing a permanent, secure base for trade in the Navy, open 5 treaty ports, Canton, Xiamen, Ningbo, and Shanghai, where British merchants could live and trade freely, ending the Canton system, pay a crushing indemnity of 21 million silver dollars, covering the destroyed opium, British war costs, and unpaid merchant debts, grant extraterritoriality. British subjects in China would be tried under British law, not Chinese. Institute a most favored nation clause, meaning any privilege China granted to another country would automatically go to Britain. There was one staggering, cynical omission in the treaty's text. The word opium appeared nowhere. The cause of the war, the poison ravaging the nation, remained technically illegal, but with the Qing authority shattered, with British merchants and gunboats now permanently on the coast, the trade didn't just continue, it exploded. The Treaty of Nanjing was not a peace treaty. It was a blueprint for subjugation. For the British, it was a triumph of free trade and a civilization. For the king, it was a humiliation so deep it could not be spoken. The dynasty had lost the mandate of heaven in the eyes of many. And in the south, a failed scholar, haunted by visions, began to gather an army of the dispossessed. His name was his rebellion. The Taiping Rebellion would soon plunge China into a civil war that would kill 20 to 30 million people, making it one of the deadliest conflicts in human history. The First Opium War was over, but the violence had just begun. The uneasy peace that followed was built on a foundation of Chinese resentment and British entitlement. It would take only the slightest spark to ignite an even greater conflagration. That spark would come from a pirate ship named the Arrow. The peace that followed the Treaty of Nanjing was an illusion. In Canton, the old flashpoint, resentment festered like an infected wound. The treaty gave foreigners the right to enter the walled city, but local officials and citizens, humiliated and angry, blocked the gates for a decade. This wasn't just disobedience, it was the last vestige of a worldview that refused to accept the new reality. In Beijing, the Qing court was consumed by a far greater fire. The Taiping Rebellion, led by the Christian-inspired mystic Hong Ziyuquan, had erupted in 1850. By the mid-1850s, the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom controlled the fertile Yangtze River heartland, had established a capital at Nanjing, and threatened to topple the dynasty itself. 20 to 30 million people would die in this civil war. The Qing Empire was fighting for its life. Western powers watched this internal carnage with cold, strategic eyes. They had won their treaty ports, but the trade was not as lucrative as dreamed. They wanted more. Ambassadors in Beijing, the full legalization of opium, access to China's vast interior. The king's weakness was their opportunity. All they needed was an excuse. In the fall of 1856, one was provided by a pirate, a flag, and 2 men pathologically incapable of backing down. On October 8th, Chinese Marines in Canton boarded a lorcha, a hybrid vessel named the Arrow. They were chasing pirates. The Arrow's crew was Chinese, but the ship was registered in Hong Kong and flew the British flag. As the Chinese seized the crew, the British captain claimed they tore down the Union Jack. The facts were murky. The Arrow S registration had likely expired. The flag may not have been flying, but facts were irrelevant. What mattered was perception and ambition. For Harry Parkes, the British consul in Canton, the Arrow incident was a gift. Here was a clear insult to the British flag, a violation of the treaty. For Yi Mingchen, the viceroy of Liangguang, it was a matter of sovereignty. Arresting Chinese suspects on a pirate vessel, regardless of its shady registration, was his right and duty. Parkes demanded the crew's release and a full apology. He released most of the men, but refused to apologize for acting within his rights. The standoff was total. Parkes, without waiting for orders from London, unleashed the navy. Canton was bombarded. The Second Opium War had begun, not with a strategic decision, but with a local official's temper and a diplomat's hunger for confrontation. In London, the government of Lord Palmerston faced criticism. Was this really worth a war? Then, Palmerston played his masterstroke. He framed the issue not as the arrow, but as British honor and the need to secure a proper modern relationship with China. He won the election in a landslide. The war had its mandate. Britain would not fight alone. France, under Napoleon III, was eager for imperial glory. It found its casus belli in the execution of a Catholic missionary, Father Auguste Chapdelaine, in the interior of China. Now, it was a crusade for free trade and for religious access. The Anglo-French alliance was born. By late 1857, a combined expeditionary force stormed Canton. Viceroy Humen, who had refused to fortify the city believing it would provoke worse consequences, was captured in his own Yemen. He would be exiled to India, where he starved himself to death. A final silent protest. The road to Beijing was now open. In 1858, the Allies forced the king to sign the Treaty of Tientsin. It granted everything the West wanted: more treaty ports, ambassadors in Beijing, freedom of movement for missionaries, and the legalization of the opium trade. But the Xianfeng emperor, holed up in his summer retreat in Rui, refused to ratify it. Humiliation was one thing. Accepting these terms as permanent law was another. The war resumed. In 1860, a massive Anglo-French force landed, intent on marching to Beijing and forcing the emperor's hand. They faced one last formidable obstacle. The Taku forts guarding the river approached to Tianjin. Here, the Chinese scored a rare, shocking victory. Mismanagement by the British led to a disastrous amphibious assault. Troops wading through mud were cut down by concentrated fire. The Allies were repulsed with heavy losses. For a moment, the King Court dared to hope. That hope was an illusion. The British Parliament, enraged by the defeat, voted for a massive escalation. By the summer, a reinforced army returned. This time, they leveled the Taku forts with overwhelming bombardment and marched inland. As the armies neared Beijing, a diplomatic party led by Harry Parkes himself, now the chief interpreter and a key strategist, rode ahead under a flag of truce to negotiate. They were seized by Seng Rinchen's troops. What followed was a descent into barbarity that would seal the fate of China's greatest cultural treasure. The hostages were taken to the Board of Punishments in Beijing. They were tortured. They were tortured. They were bound with akangs, heavy wooden boards, so tight they could not lie down. They were left in filth. 19 of them, including a journalist for the Times, died. When news reached the Allied commander, Lord Elgin, he was furious. He needed to deliver a punishment so severe, so personal to the emperor, that it would crush the king's spirit forever. Bombarding Beijing itself would harm innocent civilians. Executing prisoners would stoop to their level. He found his answer, not the forbidden city, the seat of government. He would target the emperor's soul. 8 miles northwest of Beijing lay the Yuan, the garden of perfect brightness, known to the West as the Old Summer Palace. It was not a single building, but a paradise. A complex of palaces, pavilions, lakes, and hills spanning 350 hectares. It housed centuries of imperial art, jades, silks, porcelain, ancient scrolls, libraries of rare manuscripts. Jesuit astronomers had built elaborate fountains and clockwork marvels for the emperors. It was the private, aesthetic heart of the Qing Dynasty. On October 6, 1860, French troops arrived first. They began to loot, stuffing their sacks and packs with treasures. When the British arrived, discipline broke down completely. For days, the army descended into a frenzy of destruction. Soldiers smashed what they couldn't carry. Lord Elgin made his decision. To teach a lesson that would echo through history, the palace must be erased. On October 18th, 3,500 British troops were detailed to the task. They systematically set fire to the complex. The gardens were so vast it took 3 full days of burning. A young French officer wrote, "We looked with sadness on the magnificent ruins. This fabulous palace, now nothing but a memory." Lord Elgin, in his own justification, called it a solemn act of retribution. One British soldier pocketed a small, bewildered Pekingese dog found in the ruins. He named it Aluti and later gave it to Queen Victoria. The emperor's personal paradise was reduced to ashes and shattered stone. With the summer palace in ruins, the emperor's brother, Prince Gong, was left to surrender. He signed the Convention of Peking in 1860, ratifying all the hated terms. Now, the opium trade was now not just rampant, but legal. Foreign diplomats would reside in Beijing. China ceded the Kowloon Peninsula to Britain. They became centers of commerce, finance, and connection, the very engines of the power that now dominates world affairs. The ultimate irony is profound. The points of deepest humiliation were transformed into the symbols of ultimate resurgence. What were the Opium Wars really about? They were about tea, silver, and addiction. They were about free trade and national humiliation. They were about the arrogance of empire and the desperation of a dynasty in decay. But at their core, they were about the violent integration of an ancient, inward-looking civilization into the brutal, expansionist system of modern global capitalism. The British did not just want to sell a drug. They wanted China to play by their new Western-made rules of the world. Rules of open markets, gunboat diplomacy, and the supremacy of the nation state. They forced that integration at the point of a bayonet, with the justification of civilization in their mouths and the smell of opium and burning palaces in the air. The world that was born from that collision, a world of treaties written in foreign languages, of customs houses run by foreigners, of a national psyche forged in shame, is the world that still shapes the rising power of China and its fraught relationship with the West today. The wars are over, but their long, dark shadow stretches across the centuries right into our present.